Okay, so this is kind of where we left off in the last video, so we'll pick right back up where we left off. So this is the restored view of the Temple of Amun-Re, and it's a large sanctuary that was built to honor Amun-Re, the sun god. And it was added to over a course of many years, so it ended up becoming very large. It's actually around 250 acres large, and it has a large wall as well running around the outside of it that's around 40 feet high and 25 feet thick. And it has an artificial sacred lake inside of it, which is kind of a reference to the sacred waters that existed before creation began. And then the Temple of Amun-Re rises out of, this area, much like the mound rose out at the beginning of time, as the mound rose from the waters at the beginning of time. And that's from the Egyptian creation story, the ancient Egyptian creation story. And these temples of the New Kingdom are called pylon temples, and they have axial plans, which means the architectural plan of the building. If you were to draw a line down the center of it, it would be symmetrical on either side. Now, if I drew the line this way, it wouldn't be symmetrical, but we're talking about down the longest axis of this temple. They are symmetrical on either side. And they also tended to have monumental facades, or facades, on the outside. So that would be this area here. And they typically faced the Nile River in order to greet the visitors that came by boat from the Nile River. And they were typically on either side of the river, especially in the Thebes district. And the pylons, typically the outsides, were covered with reliefs of their rulers who were defenders of, the Egyptian stability, and they were the only ones, the pharaohs and the priests were the only ones that were actually allowed to enter the mysterious inner workings of the deepest parts of the temple. So only the priests and the pharaohs themselves were allowed into the deepest chambers of the temple. And here's an example of the actual real Amun-Re temple that's left near the Nile River. So only a chosen few were actually admitted into the great columnar hypostyle halls. They were a little bit deeper as you walked into the pylon temples. They were a little bit deeper. They weren't the deepest level, but they were deeper than some of the other levels of the temple. And the only light that illuminates the hall comes through a clear story. But visitors could only go most visitors only went as far as the sun-drenched court, which would have been before you reached the columnar hypostyle halls. So most people didn't even make it this far in to the temples, to the pylon temples. So this is the hypostyle hall in the Temple of Amun-Re in Karnak, and you can see there's some huge, massive columns. There's 134 of these sandstone columns, and they kind of have a bud or bell-shaped capital that resembles a flowering lotus or papyrus, which they are symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, so that could be why they're using that symbolism there. The 12 central columns in the middle here are definitely taller than the ones that flank them, and they actually help to raise the central portion of the roof up a little bit higher. And then on the sides, these were actually windows that were left open. So the sunlight was allowed to come in through here and actually illuminate the space. And that's called a clear story. So clear stories are basically areas of roof that are raised above other areas where there's a window that lets light in. Because obviously they didn't have electricity like we do. So they had to come up with inventions like the clear story, which is basically an elevated additional story with openings that enable sunlight into the interior. And it's definitely an Egyptian, the clear story is an Egyptian innovation that is later borrowed by other cultures. So here's columns and the clear story of the hypostyle hall in Amun-Re, in the Temple of Amun-Re. So this is the actual, and I guess that these are so large that like quite a few people can, I think they're 22 feet in diameter or something like that. So they're huge, they're really massive. Okay, so let's move on to some sculpture. So this is Senemet with Princess Nefertiti from Thebes, Egypt, 18th dynasty, 1470 to 1460 BCE. It's made out of granite and it's about 3.5 feet high. So block statues, this is referred to as a block statue. It's popular during the New Kingdom because they were well suited for these lengthy inscriptions. And they were also susceptible to less damage. And they are very simplified forms than anything that you could find in the Old Kingdom. So the block statues are typically a New Kingdom style of statue. And so they can also serve as the home of the Ka if the embalmed corpse is damaged. And this actually shows Senemet, who is Hatshepsut's chancellor, with her daughter Nefertiti, and really most of the attention is on the head of the figures. And he holds her in his lap and kind of envelops her in what seems to be a cloak. And he was her tutor, so that's why he's pictured with this young child, because he's the tutor. We're going to move on to musicians and dancers. So this is a detail from the mural of the tomb of Nebaman in Thebes. Nebaman. Thebes, 18th dynasty, 1400 through 1350 BCE. And it's a fresco secco, which means that this was painted on dried plaster. So this Nebaman was a wealthy man. He was a scribe, so he was, higher up in Egyptian society. He was also a grain counter, which means he probably dealt with trading grain. And this painting was done in fresco secco, which means it's painted on dry plaster. So the walls were prepared with a wet plaster. They let that dry. They might have even sanded it a little bit to get it nice and smooth. And then they would apply the pigment on that. And it's a really durable medium to work with. And the mural shows noblemen watching and participating in a musical performance in which two almost nude girls dance at a funerary ceremony. So we can see them dancing here at this ceremony. There's a lot of, the wealthy people sitting here in their seats. And then there's some musicians, I believe, here, and women, different women, that are kind of moving their heads around and almost seem to be kind of dancing to the music. And this shows a ceremony or a banquet in which they drank a lot of beer and wine, and they thought that that helped them communicate with the dead. So they would get very intoxicated at these events. And so this is definitely a significant fresco that shows what New Kingdom artists are doing. They're not adhering to the old norms. They're starting to break out of that figural representation that was so strict and regimented with that canon system for so many years. They're actually starting to not use the canon as much in the New Kingdom. They're starting to kind of show different perspectives. So they're showing these women in a way more naturalistic way. We don't have that twisted perspective of the frontal torso and the side. And so this is a much more natural representation of the body. And then we have a fully frontal figure here. So we're not having the head from the side and then the torso from the front. These are completely different ways of painting figures that we have not seen in ancient Egyptian art up until the New Kingdom. So it's definitely important for that reason. So definitely the royal figures are still in that kind of typical profile frontal view, though. Like you can see that they're still very rigid, probably still using the canon up here, but down here in the lower class people, they are definitely breaking with tradition, and they're even showing movement with the women's hair, like they're moving their heads around to the music, and there's movement seen in their hair. So that's definitely a far cry from the rigid forms found in most Old Kingdom murals. And the subject of the murals in Nibanum's tomb are food, drink banquets, hunting, and fishing themes. And like I said earlier, success in the hunt symbolized the triumph of good over evil in ancient Egyptian society. So we're going to move on. So at one point, Akhenaton was a pharaoh that abandoned the worship of most of the Egyptian gods in favor of one god. And the god's name was Aton. And he was identified with the sun disk, so that's how they represented him in their art, was just a simple sun disk. And Akhenaton declared Aton the one and only god, and he kind of led a revolution in ancient Egyptian society at the time, a revolution in religion, which led to revolution in ancient Egypt's artistic tradition at that time too. So we can take a look at the statue of Akhenaton from the temple of Aton in Karnak, and we can see that the revolution is taking place in this figure here. The standard, he's definitely in the standard frontal pose. He has his arms crossed, but there are some major differences. He has a rather effeminate body. He has a lot of curving contours, much like a woman's hips. Even his belly is kind of feminine almost. And then he has a long face with full protruding lips, heavy-lidded eyes, and he seems to have kind of a weak arms, so he's not very muscular. And his hips are, like I said, very wide like a woman's, and fatty thighs. So many people that when they first found this, they thought it was a woman represented, but it's actually Akhenaton. And they've thought maybe it was a medical condition that he had. Many scholars kind of were wondering if that's what was going on here, if this is the way he actually looked. But doctors today haven't been able to figure that out. So many historians believe this is actually an artistic convention and was not meant to anatomically represent Akhenaton in any kind of way or in any kind of accurate way. It was probably a deliberate artistic reaction against the established style that had been going on, and it does parallel the rejection of the traditional religion that was going on during the time. So in Aton, the sun disk did not take form in a composite creature or in any kind of human form in their art as well. He was simply just a sun disk. Every time he was represented, it was just a disk with rays coming out of it, I think. So maybe this statue was supposed to be androgynous, kind of a manifestation of Aton. So kind of a sexless being with godlike powers. Maybe he's trying to be neither male or female. They're not quite sure, but what we do know is the style changes drastically under Akhenaton, and so does the religion. So let me check and see how much time we have. Okay, we're kind of running out of some time, but we have time for this, I think. So this is a bust of Nefertiti from Amarna, Egypt, 18th dynasty. It's painted limestone. It's 1 foot and 8 inches high, and Tutmos is the artist, and it's a bust, so it means from like the neck up, basically. And it's a great example of the new Amarna style. And Nefertiti was Akhenaton's queen, and she was an important woman. She does appear often in Egypt art from this period. And Tutmos is the sculptor, and he kind of left this unfinished. They found it in his workshop, and so the left eye, lacks the inlaid part of the eye, as you can see. And the weight of the crowned head does kind of echo a really heavily laden flower stalk. So it kind of looks like her neck is unusually long. She has those heavy-lidded eyes, the very full lips. She just has a lot of the style that came about under the rule of Akhenaton. So Okay, well, I'm going to stop here.